The breakdown of order in Eastern DRC has been described as the world's most neglected crisis. The plight of millions has also been described as one of the worst humanitarian crises of this century. Congo has been struggling to push back M23 rebels since they launched a comeback offensive in the DRC to file a complaint with the International Court of Justice, ICJ, over Rwanda's failure to respect its border. This is another way, according to them, of exerting pressure on Rwanda. Now, there are two international courts when it comes to armed violence: the International Court of Justice, ICJ, and the International Criminal Court, that's the ICC. There doesn't seem to be much optimism, but all options are on the table. Can either of these courts move the long-running and increasingly violent conflict in Eastern DRC away from civilians and into the courtroom? Well, we'll try and unravel that. My guest is Nixon Katembo. He's an African Affairs Analyst and joins us from Johannesburg, South Africa. Nixon, thank you for giving us your time.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start with a little background, just as brief as you can make it, of Rwanda's involvement in the Eastern DRC conflict and its motivations.
Well, I think Rwanda's involvement in Eastern DRC dates back in 1996 when Rwanda invading forces together with Uganda got inside the DRC and got rid of Mobutu, installed Kabila. In 1998, the two countries, Rwanda and Uganda, fought over mineral control in Kisangani after Kabila had chased both armies to go back to their respective countries. And since then, there have been formation of rebellions coming from Rwanda, quote unquote, led by Congolese Tutsis, who are by extensions part of the Rwandan government. And since then, there has been a continuation of this reincarnation of armed conflict under the name of protecting Tutsis in Eastern DRC. But in real sense, it's Rwanda engineering all these conflicts. But you ask me about what is the interest in it. You see, Rwanda is developing at the backdrop of Congolese resources. Of course, we cannot deny that Rwanda also had developed capacity in terms of its human capital, but also on resources that have come from the DRC. Therefore, you cannot disassociate Rwanda's economic output to the world from the conflict in the DRC. For example, just recently, Rwanda became the first world coltan producer, yet they don't have mines for coltan, neither mine for gold, yet Rwanda is producing so much of gold, all of which coming from the Eastern DRC. So the motive is both political and economic in a sense, but also the caveat to drive those interests is always behind the Congolese ethnic minority Tutsis under the guise of protecting them, saying that the Congolese government do not recognize them. And we should mention that the Congolese constitutions recognize Congolese Tutsis. Some of them have been in the army. As of January this year, for example, there were over 1,893 officers, high-ranking officers from the Congolese Tutsi communities in the Congolese National Army. They are persons who have served as a vice president of the DRC, as well as in parliament, the likes of Azarias Ruberwa, Moise Nyarugabo, and Bizima Kara, and so on. So the notions that Congolese Tutsis are not well recognized, this is just a caveat on a Rwandan part to continue a sort of a justification of its meddling in DRC affairs. And I think, as you correctly said, this has been documented by various UN group of experts reports from 2003 up until today, including human rights reports as well as civil society organizations, including those under the United Nations.
If we can fit it in before this conversation is over, I'd like to explore the role of the UN and other international bodies in this conflict. But for now, let's stay home and talk about how the DRC government is responding to Rwanda's involvement and what are their demands. Just give us a picture as well of this.
Well, the demand has always the integration of these Congolese, so-called Congolese Tutsis in the national army. And whereas we have seen that most of which are who are people who work on Rwanda's interests in infiltrating the DRC army. The second has always been sort of having a semi-autonomous government in provinces such as the Eastern DRC, or provinces of Kivu, South Kivu and North Kivu, as well as places like Turi. But if you look at it, if you have a semi-autonomous government, that means you are sort of paving the way for secession of those regions, some of which the Congolese citizens who are residing in those areas are against, although it is advocated by this minority. But on the part of the government as well, there has been some laxity in terms of delivering services to the people in Eastern DRC and protecting them. And this emanates from the continued chaos. But also, if you look at the political transitions within the DRC and nature of the security mayhem that have happened the past over 30 years, have opened the room for the lack of state control in provinces under insecurity, and therefore leaving the room for mayhem and the armed group to continue. And much of these armed groups are, by the way, funded by either senior army officers in the Rwandan army or in the Ugandan army, to make sure that they continue the plundering of natural resources through proxy militias, and therefore making it the DRC as if it is ungovernable in that sense. And this is the problem. And I think for the DRC, what they have failed to do as a government, it is to study thoroughly these problems, making sure that they do a security sector reform, reform the army, reform the institution of the state, making sure that they are responsive to the needs of the people globally within the country, and in particular to those regions that have faced violence since 1996 up until to date.
Okay. There's so many issues you've just raised, but let's take a look at, let me go back and put it this way. This conflict has been ongoing for a while, and the talk in the intellectual zones is that all options are on the table. I want you to speak when we say all options for dialogue and resolution are on the table. This includes international law. So I want you to explore this conversation for us as broadly as you can.
Well, the options that you are talking about, you have to look at the nature of a global involvement in the DRC, including the UN. And I can go from arguing from an ideological standpoint in terms of how capitalism and global economic architecture work in terms of 3 or 4 points. One, the monopoly of violence, who control violence. 2, who control the economic systems of the world. And 3, who control then the political decisions that go into that, some of which have not worked in the case of the DRC, looking at the presence of the UN. And for me, I think there have to be a political will on the part of the international community. For example, those who are benefiting from the extraction of mineral resources in the conflict zone are multinational companies. And if those multinational companies are not having that particular political will to understand that the mayhem cannot go on, and we can be able to extract the resources differently by cooperating with the people of the DRC and the government, and helping that the resources that come out of the DRC benefit the people where these resources are coming from. And I think that's one aspect on the part of the international community. On the part of the DRC government, they have to be a new strategic and ideological direction on where the country need to be directed in terms of political stability, in terms of a political culture, and as well as a strategic objective of the country on where the DRC and its resources should be, and in a family of nations. On the part of the neighbors such as Rwanda, of course, a state, in realism, the state are never benevolent. They serve first their interests. But how do those interests align with the regional stability? So what need to be done? And there have to be a political will on part of Rwanda, on part of Uganda, on part of Burundi, on part of Tanzania, on part of Kenya. All these countries surrounding and the DRC, and have a vested interest in the DRC to make sure that, one, they look at the stability of the region, not only the DRC alone, but the stability of the region, which does not necessarily look at the extractive means through violence to achieve their economic interest in Eastern DRC. And I think that is what have lacked since to date.
Okay, I want us to also talk about the DRC has explored a lot of options, and one of them, over the years, they've also used international courts like the ICJ, I believe. I'm not sure if they've used the ICC as well. But I want you to talk about the use of international law in trying to resolve this conflict, and in what ways, in your view, is Rwanda continuing to circumvent international legal frameworks?
Well, they do have to look at those courts that you mentioned earlier, the ICJ and the ICC. One, the ICC is a political court, even as much as there is a Rome Statute that talks about this, the rule of law in the international system, but it's a more of political court because it depends on the political wills of member states who have ratified the Rome Statute. If they are going to implement it, well and good. On part of the ICJ, despite being an independent court of the United Nations, there's still a political influence from members of the Permanent Security Council, namely the 5. And if you look at France, Britain, the United States, these are countries that have been supporting Rwanda in one way or another. For example, the US have trained the Rwandan military. The UK has given so much of aid, but also training some of Rwandan military in support of their interest in the region. The recent case is the Rwandan army being used sort of hired gun in Mozambique to protect Total's investment of $4 billion in a gas project in Mozambique's Cabo Delgado province. And you see the European Union giving about 20 million euros to the Rwandan government, is quote unquote advancing the peace and security in Mozambique, but in real sense it's a protection of Total Energy's infrastructures and interests in Mozambique. So is much said also in Eastern DRC, where the European Union just recently, about 2 months ago, signed what they call mineral protections in terms of what is going, but you wonder what kind of mineral for resources, whereas they know exactly that Rwanda is extracting these minerals from the DRC through violence and through sending its military there. And I think that is the something that has not been spoken about in terms of how this filter through how the application of law in terms of the case of the DRC, particularly the ICC cases or the ICJ cases happen when it comes to the DRC. For example, the Congolese government accused Uganda for plundering the resources after the UN produced several reports to that effect. Uganda was fined about 10 billion US dollars, but this case was eventually settled out of court because of a political interference, and Uganda agreed to pay only $4 billion. Up to date, that money has never been paid. The case at the ICC, for example, it looked only what happened in the Ituri province, but it did not look globally on what has happened in Eastern DRC since 1996 and since Rwanda's and Uganda's invasions by removing Mobutu at the time. And today, if those who have perpetrated violence are not held accountable for by these institutions that are supposed to defend the weakest, then one wonder what is behind this. And we know what is behind this is just the extraction of resources by multinational corporations from these 5 influential permanent members of the UN Security Council, but also the entire European Union, including to furthering its economy, owing to the fact that the DRC produce about 70% of the world cobalt, over 65% of the world coltan, and many other rare minerals, including gold and diamonds.
International law is, I started by saying there doesn't seem to be a lot of optimism on what role it can play, but could it be a source towards ending the conflict in the DRC? When I say this, I'm mindful of the fact that Rwanda has not subscribed previously when there was a ruling in its favor. Of course, he accepted, but when there was a ruling against Rwanda, they refused to accept the authority. They've not joined the ICC or the ICJ. So that on its part, it's a hurdle in the implementation of whatever decisions that the court makes. I guess my question is there a way the international law can be strengthened to be of more relevance in quests to look for solutions to the conflicts that we have across Africa?
I think international law have to be applied to, you have to look at whose benefits, who stand to gain in terms of the application of international law in the case of the DRC, for example. When you have a country like Rwanda being supported by the UK and the US and other financial institutions from Western countries for its budget of over 49%, that says a lot, that if these institutions and these countries are able to take a political decision to send up to Rwanda to say, we don't want you to perpetrate this in Eastern DRC, it would be serving sort of an application of international law. But as I said, if these countries do not see any benefit in the application of the rule of law when it comes to the DRC where they stand to benefit, then the question is, why should they apply international law in that manner? And we have seen these cracks emerging in terms of what they call a rule-based order in the world, where you have a President Putin is indicted for abducting quote-unquote Ukrainian children, but where the same international institutions and law support to Israel, where it is the International Court of Justice have said in the case of South Africa versus Israel over the case of Palestine, showing that there is a plausible genocide. Yet the US, the UK, the European Union, France, including all of them standing against the ICC for issuing Benjamin Netanyahu and the Hamas leaders arrest warrants. So you have to look at the application of international law, really, which is not even, because it looks at who stand to benefit politically, and mostly who are the most powerful nations that have a political say in international affairs.
Important questions to ponder, indeed. I mean, from a layman's position, when you look at it, you expect that we should take politics aside and really look at how the laws can help citizens, really, who have no other protection, because they are the vulnerable ones that are caught in this conflict. Let's move away from the International Court for a second and look at potential solutions or strategies that could be utilized to hold Rwanda accountable for its actions in the Eastern DRC conflict.
Well, one is to have a reform of the institution of the state inside the DRC. Those institutions must be built in order to be responsive to the development of the DRC. Second, there have to be a security sector reform within the defense framework of the DRC, including rebuilding a new army. Third, there have to be a new political culture that is driven with a clear strategic vision for the development of the DRC, so that it is able to fend off outside evasions such as Rwanda's interference in the country. And the fourth is look at now economic policies that seeks to invite all that who are willing to back through the back channels, rather coming back to directly and talk to the government of the DRC and invest in the DRC. And that can only be built under a leadership that understand the nature of geopolitics and the value of the DRC in the international community, but in a global economic affairs. And if not, if you still have a predatory state inside the DRC on the part of those ruling elites, not knowing where the country should be governed and what should be governed, but they look at enriching themselves, there will be always problems. The countries have to recognize self, and I think that can only come from the young people who would reimagine a new vision for the Congo and making a political reform and economic reform that are going to seek to develop the country and lift the country out of the political and the security quagmire that it finds itself for now.
I'm honestly very skeptical about asking the role of the African Union in resolving conflicts across Africa, including the case in the DRC. But I won't ask. Rather, I want you to paint us a picture. Remind us, what is the humanitarian impact of the conflict on civilians in the region and the urgency to look for a middle ground, a solution to the conflict?
Well, I think various UN reports have demonstrated that there is a dire humanitarian problem that is currently happening. M23 have been shelling camp of displaced people. These are people who are malnourished, who have no food, no UN supports that over 6 million have died. So the question is, Congolese lives matter really for it to warrant this continuation of violence, and deliberate violence, by the way, meted out against unarmed and defenseless civilians. And I think there have to be really a new thinking about what life means and what governance means for the people of the DRC on a part of international community and the government of the DRC, including the government of the region, to make sure that violence is not the only way that solve issues, but there is to make sure that there is a political will to solve these issues, either through dialogue and that dialogue must be held sincerely, not the dialogue that have been held since 2003 up until today. For example, there has been numerous talks between the Congolese warring parties from 1997 up until to date, but much of which the implementation has always ended up in a new creation of armed group to which further escalate the humanitarian crisis on a part of the unarmed civilian in Eastern DRC.
Nixon, thank you very much for speaking with us. I'd like to just reiterate just 2 lines of what you said. You're emphasizing on new thinking on the quality of life, on the value that we place on life, and of course, the quality of governance that we have, not just in the DRC, but among global leaders. Thank you again for your contribution.
Thanks for having me.